Good morning. Welcome to this seminar that's hosted by the CTS Planning and Economy Council. My name is Jonathan Ehrlich. I am the Vice Chair of the Council this year and will be moderating this event. Some local housekeeping notes. There is a sign-up sheet on the front door. If you haven't signed up, try to sign up before you leave. There is coffee and infused grapefruit water and bagels over there. Please help yourself if you're in this location. If you're not in this location, I'm sorry, we can't help you. Do we do introductions at? It doesn't
really work well online.
Okay, so we're not going to do introductions. Some brief housekeeping notes. After our presentations, we'll have time for questions and answers. If you're in the room, please remember to speak into this microphone. We will pass it back around so that online viewers can hear. If you're participating online, type questions into the chat box, and we will read and respond to them out loud. Please also use the chat box to let us know about any technical difficulties you may experience. Both PDH and AICP credits are available for this event. Please ask Colleen if you have questions about claiming these credits. And everyone should remember and sign up for the CTS Research Conference, which will be held on November 3rd. Registration is now open at www.cts.umn.edu. So our first speaker today is Yingling Fan, who is the McKnight Land Grant Professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Fan studies the health and social impacts of urban land use, growth management, and transit improvement. She has a PhD in city planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her recent work focuses on employment accessibility and social mobility, regional economic competitiveness, transit development, along with access to green space and opportunities for healthy physical activity, all informed by a strong social equity perspective. Yingling.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the warm introduction. I'm very delighted to be here. So my presentation today is about a project we recently completed where we look at waiting time perceptions at transit stops and stations in the Twin Cities region. And I wanted to mention that the project was a part of the TERP program. TERP is the Transit Way Impacts Research Program. It's a program managed by Center for Transportation Studies at the University of Minnesota. So this is a very interesting question, right? How does the happiness vary across triple categories? They are actually, the data actually not coming from the station and the stops projects. The data I'm showing here comes from national data, which is American Time Use Survey. So American Time Use Survey is an annual survey of 5,000 people across the United States, and it started back in 2003, and it's every year there is a survey of 5,000 American residents. So as of now, it already accumulated a large data set of how people use time in the United States and what are people's feelings when they do different activities, including trips. So I derived the trip data out of the American Time Use Survey and looked at people's feelings, emotions during their trips. So this is a simple bar chart visualizing that how levels of happiness vary across trip categories by mode as well as by trip duration. So if you see a bar above 0, so I set a car driver, that category as 0. So anything above 0 means the mode that has a higher levels of happiness than car driver. And any bar below 0 indicating that the mode have lower levels of happiness compared to car driving. So the results actually quite not surprising. As you can see, bike is the most happy mode out of the many modes that we have. And the public transit is the least happy mode out of the modes we have. And you can see walk and car passenger actually not statistically significant compared to car driving. which is not surprising as well because the walking mode here is walking for transportation. It's not walking for recreation purposes. So essentially, what does this mean as a transportation planner? Well, certainly we want to promote biking, right? It contributes to happiness and health. Happiness is important for health. But in terms of public transit, we cannot, public transit is a very important transportation mode. For people who do not have cars, public transit means job accessibility, means opportunities to access not only jobs, also all kinds of other opportunities, such as shopping, recreation, right? And also, we know that relatively speaking, public transit is much more environmental sustainable compared to driving. So, given that in our society, a significant number of people have to rely upon public transportation, it is important that we improve the infrastructure, public transportation infrastructure, so that we can make sure that people who use the public transit also have the same level of happiness compared to people who drive cars. And also, in terms of trip duration categories, it's not surprising that people who commute more than 45 minutes tend to be less happy. So when you think about public transit trips, typically there are 3 segments. You need to get to the transit station. So you have a segment where you get to transit station, a segment where we call it a waiting time segment, right? You have to wait at the transit station or stop, and then you have on vehicle time, right? So you have out of vehicle time, on vehicle time, and also you have this waiting time. And out of those 3 types of transit travel time, which one is most unpleasant? Actually, the research already show that it's well established that waiting time is the most unpleasant. Okay, so waiting at a bus stop has been considered as the least happy moments of one's life. Actually, there are, scholars study happiness and have pointed out that, waiting at bus stops are really unpleasant. So every minute at a bus stop feels longer than it actually is. And if you look at the empirical evidence, every minute at a bus stop could feel like 0.2 to 2 minutes. Okay, so it's essentially that if you wait for 5 minutes, somebody may feel like waiting for 10 minutes at the bus stop. So to understand, how station environments and how stop amenities at the stops, how those transit stop and station infrastructure affects people's waiting time perception. So we did a study in the Twin Cities region, and we diversified study types. We diversified the study sites. So certainly we look at the transitway stations, right? Those are the stations that very high amenity, have a lot of amenities, including real-time arrival information. Certainly shelter, premium shelter, and other amenities. Of course, we also want to look at stops that have a very basic amenity, a very basic shelter, not necessarily in a pleasant waiting environment, surrounding environment. And those we also have a very new park and ride station, park and ride stations, high amenity. But it's different surrounding environment compared to walk and ride stations. And in the Twin Cities, you know that it's important to do winter data collection as well as summer data collection. The waiting experience in the winter are dramatically different from the waiting experience in the summer. We also did data collection during different times of the day. So we had the daytime data collection as well as the nighttime data collection. And as you can imagine, nighttime data caching, depending upon where you are waiting for the bus, you may have some security concerns. So what's the study approach? The study approach is very straightforward because essentially the two most important study variables, one is waiting time perception, so perceived waiting time. Another one is actual waiting time, right? So to measure actual waiting time, we needed to do observation. And to measure perceived waiting time, we need to ask directly and have passengers self-report how long they consider they have waited, right? So essentially, it's just observation plus survey. That's our study approach. Observation, we did it by videotaping at those study sites, because the public transit stops and stations actually are public spaces, so we got permission from University IRB to videotape, at those stations and stops. So we were able to measure based upon the videotapes how long people actually waited. And then we had students. So we had two groups of students. So one group of students are kind of doing the videotaping. Another group of students actually get on the bus with the people who waited at the transit stop, and then distributed survey as soon as the people get on the bus. And on this survey, the first question is how long do you think that you waited at this bus stop, right? And we have how we link people who fill out the survey to the people appeared in the videotape is that we actually, when the passenger completed the survey, we ask for their permission to take a picture of them holding the survey, with this number visible, and then we do face matching between that picture and the videotape. So we were able to look at, for the same person, what were his or her waiting time perception and what was his or her actual waiting time. So we did a very complicated, we did use a sophisticated statistical modeling. I'm not going to show you the equations. I will just show you the results. So you have to believe me that I did use the appropriate modeling techniques, and we did a good job in terms of data cleaning and manipulation. So you just have to trust me. So what are the results? So the results is very straightforward as well. So basically, you can see the x-axis here as actual waiting time, and the y-axis as mean prediction of reported waiting time. Okay. So for a person, and then you can see that there are two lines: the light gray dashed line, and then a green line. Here, the light gray dashed line basically indicating a stop where there are no amenities. Okay, the green line indicating stops, people waiting at the stops with basic amenities, shelter, and bench. Okay, just the basic amenities. We did compare between stops at basic amenities as well as the stops with premium amenities. So, for example, with route information, with the schedule information, there was no significant difference between stops with premium amenities and the basic amenities. So we decided just to show on this graph the basic amenity effect. Okay, so for a person who actually waited for 5 minutes, okay, if at a stop, if the stop has no amenities, he or she would feel like waited for 10 minutes, okay? But if the stop had shelter, basic amenity, shelter, and a bench, he or she will feel like waiting for 7.5 minutes. So that's actually 2.5 minute difference there, which is quite significant. And then, you can see that for a person who waited for 15 minutes at the stop, without amenities, the person will feel, waiting there for 20 minutes. But with the amenities, basic amenities, the waiting time perception is much lower, which is 17 minutes compared to the 20 minutes without amenities. And then also very interestingly, we find out that gender and security factors played a significant role as well. So, so if a female passenger waited at a bus stop for more than 10 minutes, okay, and then waiting time perception become, she would feel waiting time perception dramatically longer, okay. Now, if if a female passenger waited less than 5 minutes, then there is no significant difference in terms of waiting time perception between men and women. But when a female passenger waited more than 10 minutes, getting to the 15 minutes, if the actual waiting time is 15 minutes, you can see that the significant gender gap there in terms of waiting time perceptions. So those are our results. Of course, there are other results associated with this study. The data is very rich, but I just want to focus on those two results because I consider them that very interesting results in terms of policy implications. So the first major result is that basic amenities, including benches and shelters, significantly reduce perceived waiting time. So essentially, this means that if possible, we want to provide the basic amenities at the station and stops as broadly as possible in transit systems. A lot of the times, people actually want to create a high amenity stops. And ironically, those high amenity stops tend to have very frequent bus services or transit services. But here, what we are seeing is essentially, for those who wait longer, actual time waiting longer, for stops that don't have frequent bus services, actually, basic amenities are very important in terms of reduce people's waiting time perceptions. The other significant finding is the women waiting for more than 10 minutes in perceived insecure surroundings report waits as dramatically longer than they actually really are, and longer than do men in the same situation. So, essentially, this indicated that, again, amenity provision with a particular focus on stops on low-frequency routes and in less safe areas for security measures to close the gender gap in waiting time perception. So that concludes my presentation. I just want to acknowledge that this is a group effort. We have Andy Guasseri, who is in the audience, and also Professor David Levinson as the co-investigators.
I think we have time for a couple questions.
When you were coding the passenger waiting time, did you look at whether or not they were distracting themselves with their cell phone? Because that tends to have a big impact on people's waiting perception if they're distracting themselves versus not. And the advent of smartphones, I would imagine, is playing a role there in making people more satisfied.
Yes. So we did when we looked at had the students watch the videotape, we had the students coding whether they actually sitting or walking around or having a smartphone in hand or actually leaning against something. So all those has been considered as control variables in the model. And also the other thing, we didn't find the significant evidence in terms of people using, kind of looking at the smartphones, maybe because that we have very limited observations of people who in our sample who actually do that. But what's very interesting that a very significant variable is that if you travel with somebody versus traveling alone. So if you travel with somebody, the waiting time perception is much shorter compared to you traveling alone. Yeah.
Other questions? How did you deal with, and this might be getting too deep into the statistics, but people's tendency to round their perceived waiting times with differences that were only a couple of minutes, somebody may have rounded their waiting time or their perceived waiting time to 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
That's a really good question. Actually, we did observe rounding issues. So we see a lot of people, a lot of people when they report a perceived waiting time, it's either 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So it was there is no way to address it, to be honest, because that's what people report. That's that's how they perceive waiting time, I guess. So we just, hoping that this wouldn't skew the results too much. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that. Yeah.
Are there any online questions?
No.
Okay. Are there other questions? Thank you, Yingli.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Andy Guthrie, who is a research fellow and PhD student at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He specializes in transit planning research and has interests including regional accessibility, improved performance measures, transit service and facility design, and transit-oriented development. And he takes special interest in the resurgence of rail transit and the social equity implications of transportation. Andy.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thanks. So I will be talking with you about the economic development impacts of bus rapid transit. This is also research that came out of the Transitway Impacts Research Program, concluded last year. The research concluded last year. So just to start out with a basic statement of our research need, and everything I'm going to be saying here originally arose in the Twin Cities context in terms of the public agencies interested in seeing this research, but it has much broader implications than just the Twin Cities. So here in the Twin Cities and also nationally, BRT is going to be playing a growing role in transit systems in the coming years, both in terms of the really high-feature dedicated guideway BRT lines like our planned Metro Gold Line here in the Twin Cities, or the pretty well-known Health Line in Cleveland, or more mixed traffic operating arterial BRT or rapid bus corridors like the recently opened A Line here in the Twin Cities, or the Rapid Ride system in Seattle. Well, one of the aims of any major transit infrastructure project is to increase people's accessibility to jobs. And to do that to the greatest possible extent, you need jobs in station areas. Obviously, moving people through the transit system faster, all else equal, is going to improve their accessibility. But you'll be able to get a greater benefit by also pushing for job growth in station areas. And certainly here in the Twin Cities, and to some extent nationally, just because there isn't all that much well-established BRT yet nationally. It's a growth mode, but it's still a relatively new mode in the US. Light rail is kind of a known quantity for ability to attract development, ability to attract economic development. BRT is much less so. So we have two basic research questions for this study. First is just what determines job growth prospects in BRT station areas? And then also how and in what circumstances do those prospects differ from the prospects of a light rail station area? Now, I want to make it very clear that there's a specific question that we're not studying in this project. This is the only project I've ever had where I have to have a slide saying what we did not study. We're not looking at whether transit investments create station area jobs. Regional economic demand creates jobs, right? Transit investments, however, can determine where in the region those jobs are created. They can help determine it anyway. And already said that. And we're proceeding from a normative assumption that a job created in a location with excellent transit access is more beneficial to society than an equivalent job created in a location with very poor transit access. This especially has assumptions for, this especially has implications for social equity, just because it means that a transit-dependent person is going to be able to access that job as well. So to study this, especially because we didn't actually have any BRT that had been up and running long enough to have an after observation in terms of job growth in the Twin Cities when we did this research, we took a national perspective. We looked at 16 different regions throughout the country, starting from a list of peer regions identified by the Metropolitan Council as either points of comparison for transit system performance or transit system investment levels to the Twin Cities. And then we also added Las Vegas, Nevada, and Eugene, Oregon, just to give us a little bit more BRT, because the peer regions themselves didn't give us a lot of BRT observations. So these regions have all opened either new BRT lines or new BRT stations or new LRT lines or LRT stations between 2003 and 2011. So that allows us to use the Census Bureau's Longitudinal Employment and Household Dynamics job data set, which is a really, really powerful, very fine-grained economic data set to get both a before and an after observation for every one of those stations. So we know how many jobs there were before the station was built. We know how many jobs there were after, and we can track it every year throughout that whole period. So we got data on transit routes and stops from the transit providers themselves. We actually downloaded the source data for their Google Maps transit directions feature. We get built environment and other transportation system data from the EPA, job growth and loss data from the Census Bureau, and also basic socioeconomics. So our research approach broadly is to compare yearly job change in each station area before the implementation of the station with job change in the station area after the implementation. Now, I'm saying job change here, and I know that that's kind of an awkward phrasing. For the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be talking in terms of job growth, either more job growth or less job growth. Understand, though, that our study period does include the recession, so in some cases, more growth is actually less loss. It's easier to just talk as if everything's on one side of zero. So we're breaking this down into sector and wage categories. We're looking at traditional blue-collar sectors, productive industries, white-collar jobs, so professional jobs and high-skilled service, and also what are called pink-collar jobs. And I know that's a little less common of a terminology, but these are lower skilled service jobs that are disproportionately likely to be held by women. Pink collar jobs represent a great deal of the female working class. We're looking at the station area level, and we're using light rail as the reference point, and that allows us to get a good reference point for the Twin Cities because the blue line was already up and running. So just as Yingling, I'm not going to inflict all of our regression tables on you, but just general description of the types of variables we're including. So the variable that we are explaining the variation in is the yearly change in numbers of jobs after the implementation of the station or the line. And we're looking at that as a function of the before yearly change. The trajectory of the economy before implementation has implications for what happens afterwards. Regional population and economic factors, station area population and economic factors, how long it's been since opening, just because the effect may change over time, and also general built environment and demographic factors. So going through our findings very briefly, again, we're not going to worry about coefficients here. Just know that everything above this line predicts more job growth. Everything below this line predicts less. And the number of pluses or minuses just means more positive or less positive. So blue-collar jobs, mostly, the biggest positives are just regional factors. Metropolitan population, metropolitan change in blue-collar jobs. But we do see that the total street mileage in the station area, so that basically gives us a measure of the density of the street network, is also a positive predictor of blue-collar jobs. Now with pink-collar jobs, actually all of our significant variables were negative predictors. So things like stationary population density, these jobs are going to places that are less dense, so we're seeing there's more growth in the suburbs, essentially. Arterial BRT is a negative here, also full-featured BRT. So you get more pink-collar job growth around light rail stations than you do around BRT stations. And also some other basic economic factors as well. In terms of white-collar jobs, there aren't as many significant variables. Partly, we're using the same model of the data for all of these different types of jobs. That's kind of necessarily a compromise because the model fits better for one dependent variable or another. We chose a model that fit best for the lower status jobs because we're especially interested in promoting social equity here. But we see total street mileage in the station area is again a strong positive. Also, interestingly, we see more white-collar jobs going to areas with higher percentages of minority residents. Now that's possibly both encouraging and concerning, and we'll talk more about that in implications. Also, again, arterial BRT is a negative predictor here, but there's no significant difference between dedicated guideway BRT and light rail. So looking specifically at low-wage jobs, regardless of sector, again, we see station area economic factors, that same total street mileage. This is one of the most consistent positive predictors we found, and also regional economic factors, and again, negative for arterial BRT. And then finally, for high-wage jobs, we get, again, street mileage, again, percentage of minority residents, and also regional factors. And not surprisingly, you get fewer high-wage jobs farther from the central business district. No surprise there. Arterial BRT is again a negative, and also demographic and regional factors. So basic review of our findings is that there's a mix of regional and local determinants for the prospects for job growth in BRT station areas. One is that fixed infrastructure really matters. We are finding more of a difference between some kind of fixed infrastructure at all and no continuous fixed infrastructure. So there's a bigger difference between, there is some difference in some cases between light rail and dedicated guideway BRT, but there's a much bigger difference between either light rail or dedicated guideway BRT and arterial BRT. There's also evidence that BRT needs proactive job growth promotion efforts. Now, none of that is to say that you can't have robust job growth in BRT station areas or even arterial BRT station areas as long as your expectations are commensurate with the goals of the project, the investment level of the project. If you're spending a tenth the construction costs and getting maybe a fifth the job growth, that can actually be a really good bargain to strike in some cases. In addition, a lot of arterial BRT lines are being used, as in our observations, are being used as sort of a way of augmenting another transitway system. They're being used to feed into light rail lines. So in that case, attracting job growth to station areas isn't necessarily always the role that they're intended for. They may be intended to feed people into another system that attracts job growth to its station areas. So recommendations, one is to try to counteract that lack of continuous fixed infrastructure for arterial BRT, do everything you can to build a strong corridor identity and really stress that identity in people's perceptions. So you can almost build a continuous corridor in people's minds. One example from the recently opened A line here in the Twin Cities is every station has a tall pylon with the Metro Transit emblem on it. That's a common practice in other arterial BRT lines as well. What that does is it really expands the amount of the corridor that you can see a station from. So even though there isn't dedicated infrastructure for the running way of the transit vehicle, you can generally see a station anywhere you are on the street. Focus on providing a dense connected street network in station areas. Businesses move to or locate in transit station areas because they think there's going to be some benefit to them from it, right? Locating in a station area usually is not costless. You're often dealing with higher land costs, possibly more complex development in general. So it's necessary that they think they're going to benefit from being near the transitway, and they're not going to see a benefit if you can't get from the station to their place of business. And also, it's important to consider equity and possible spatial mismatch implications. I'm especially talking about the finding where we saw more white-collar and higher-wage jobs going into station areas with higher percentages of minority residents. Now, that could be a very good thing. There's certainly a lot of communities of color in the country that could benefit from access to better-paying jobs and higher status jobs. But the question is, are those jobs going to be available to the people who live in that neighborhood necessarily? Are they going to be requiring qualifications that the people in the neighborhood have, or are they drawing in wealthier, whiter residents from outside? So it could be improving access. It could also be the beginnings of employment gentrification, and that's something that needs to be watched carefully. So with that, I will thank you for your time. Also recognize that Yingling Fan was also a co-author on this piece, and take any questions.
Your recommendation was that there needs to be a robust street network near the stations. Does it actually have to be a street network, or can it be sidewalks and walking paths? Did you consider that?
That's an excellent point. We didn't actually have data on pedestrian pathways, just because we weren't able to obtain a national data source for it. But I think there's every reason to expect that that would have a similar effect. What we're using street network for is as a measure of access from the station area. So if you're providing that, the other thing is that especially if you're dealing with a work trip, people aren't going to have access to a car generally there. So in terms of providing access from the station, there's every reason to believe pedestrian pathways would have a similar effect. Now, that's not necessarily the only reason that the station area street network is important. Not everybody who's visiting a business in one of these station areas is actually taking transit to it. So also providing access from people from the surrounding area who are driving there is likely important as well.
Other questions? Questions from online? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Carol Hale, who has worked with Metro Transit for 2 years in the Planning and Urban Design Department. Her primary focus is integrating transit facilities within the public realm and providing facilities for people to access transit safely, easily, and comfortably. She holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the Humphrey School. Carol.
Well, thank you. As John mentioned, my name is Carol. I'll be talking to you a little bit about the customer experience at Metro Transit bus stops. As Yingling and Andy noted in their presentations, I also will not have any math for you to look at, so enjoy. So just a really quick overview of Metro Transit bus stops. There's well over 12,000 active bus stops in a very large region, a very wide-ranging array of types of bus stops as well. So everything from dense urban core, very far-flung suburbs, or almost in the country. At these stops, we do have over 1,000 shelters present. There's a little over 100 with light and heat. And currently, I should mention the qualifications for a bus stop to have a bus shelter at it would be 25 daily boardings or more in a suburban location and 40 average daily boardings or more within an urban location. I will note that that is currently being reviewed and will likely be revised. At one point in the system, the idea was to spread resources equally throughout the region. The agency is focusing a lot more now on equity and surrounding land use and other factors that may, decide whether or not a bus stop warrants a bus shelter and what level of facilities. So you may think, it'd be as easy as putting a bus shelter out on the street. Well, there are a lot of competing interests at bus stops. So, for instance, does the public want or need a bus shelter? Would it serve the needs of the neighborhood that it's in? For our service, as service changes in response to, jobs moving or people moving elsewhere, how do we anticipate or place resources, as that changes throughout time? There's also, though, adjacent property owners who may or may not want a bus stop and or shelter in front of their business or their residence. A lot of times, if there's a narrow public right-of-way, we'll need an easement in order to be able to place a shelter. You need approvals for that. There's also public safety, policymaker, even state historical society considerations to take into account. So trying to balance all that, and determine the best possible experience for customers is something that we're trying to do. One of the main ways we're doing that is through community outreach and engagement efforts. The idea for the unit I work in is to improve to the best of our abilities the local bus rider experience at bus stops. So there's a few different initiatives right now that are happening. So the Better Bus Stops program is through a Ladders of Opportunity grant that the agency applied for and received. Also a Northwest Corridor grant, which is also helping us a lot to improve the waiting experience. We also, as an agency, have developed a dedicated community outreach and engagement team. The agency somewhat recently hired a full-time staff of 4 to really go out there and be our voice or a conduit, I guess, between the communities we serve and the agency. There's also existing efforts. So the Adopt a Shelter program, for instance, if communities or people or business owners would like to help us, keep a bus stop in clean, safe working order, that's a really great way for communities to, take a little bit of ownership around a bus stop. And even, the public art it's actually a pretty robust public art collection that the agency has. Those are typically designed by someone that's really, engaged within that community and helps us to be, a part of that community. So, speaking a little bit more about the Better Bus Stop program, what is a Better Bus Stop? So, looking at things that we can easily control, so things like customer information or pedestrian improvements, people need to get to and from their bus stop in a safe, easy manner. Also, though, if there's ways to enhance the maintenance efforts at that bus stop, keeping it clean, keeping it an inviting place that people actually want to be at. And then the addition of lights and heat where possible. So, looking at where, we can kind of tie in with other projects that are happening to provide utility connections for heat and light, or where we can even use things such as solar to be able to provide that is something that we're really looking at a lot. So again, the agency is now committed to light in all new shelters that are being installed. As part of that, it's a lot easier to add light. The amount of electricity it takes to run a light is significantly less than the amount that it takes to add a heater. The heat likely will remain dependent on boardings and the amount of people that would use it, only because it is just really a lot different cost-wise for us to install and maintain that, as well as the commitment for seating in new shelters. We are revising existing shelters as possible or renovating. But again, going forward, all new will have seating in them. We're also taking a better, more comprehensive look at how shelters are sited and oriented at bus stops. So, considering our region does, experience quite a long winter, so as streets are plowed, you can imagine the windrows of snow that build up, how we balance maintenance concerns with keeping that out of the entry and exit point of shelters, but then also take into account that people want an entrance and an exit to be facing towards the street. We hear that quite often. So we've identified four main orientations and how the existing buildings or landscaping or right-of-way really is playing a bigger role in how we're siting and placing shelters now and going forward. As part of that, we're developing bus stop site layouts, so that'll be easier, or help it be easier for communities and city partners to help us review development plans so that we can make sure if there's a bus stop that can accommodate a shelter and has ridership to warrant a shelter, how we can best make sure that there's space available for us to put a shelter in. But also helping communicate the idea that clear zones are super important. So being able to get on and off the bus easily, but also if people are walking through the site, maybe they're not riding transit at that stop, but pedestrian circulation is always super important. Another thing that we're doing is upgrading all the transit information at all bus stops. So previously, you can see up in the right corner, you can tell that a bus comes and stops at a stop because there's a sign of a bus and a circle T and it says bus stop. But beyond that, it doesn't really give you much information about which route, how often it comes, if the service changes between weekday or weekend. So through an extensive community engagement effort and an effort internally, looking at how to improve that. So as you can see, adding the stop identifier number on there, if people are able to text or look up, when their bus is coming on either a smartphone or if they're able to call into our information center, giving people a little more information just helps them, get the information that they want. As we're able and as ridership again warrants, having things like route information and a map of where a route goes is also really beneficial for riders. We're also doing placemaking partnerships. So recently we've done a few. We intend to continue that. Placemaking and tactical urbanism are ways where we can get a lot of information very quickly and very easily. So these were a partnership with the Minneapolis Downtown Improvement District. They had completed a study of a similar one of how people are experiencing bus stops. A little less data than Yingling and Andy had, but just asking people, do you like waiting here? And what would improve that? The idea of again, more comfortable seating, lighting, information, those were what we understand, but then also the idea of, helping people know what time it is or giving people something to do so that you aren't just standing there, on the sidewalk. These were all low-cost, temporary improvements that we learned quite a bit from. We're not intending to add a living room rug at every bus stop, obviously, but by making a stop more inviting, it really affects how people experience waiting for transit. And also, I should mention that the lower right-hand installation, it was a greenhouse shelter installation that's actually still up, but It's located adjacent to where an urban farmers market is happening, and the shelter structure itself is providing a growing media for herbs. And so just even, paying more attention to the context that a bus shelter is in, is more important, or is important. Another thing that we're doing is where it makes sense, where if there's a pretty narrow, public right-of-way and a new building going up, and there's ridership and service that would, again, make a shelter make sense, how can we provide more pedestrian, access by getting that shelter off of the sidewalk, actually, and having a little, nook or niche in a building, having that integrated within the footprint. It, is a much more permanent looking structure. Oftentimes we can partner with the property owner to do daily maintenance, which is, wonderful. And then again, it's again just a good riding or waiting environment for transit riders. So they're going forward. There's some lofty goals that we have. So again, the transit information signage that I showed you, that's going to be rolled out to every bus stop. So that's something we're really excited about. We are committed to installing 150 new shelters. Near term, that'll be about 40. It takes, a while to assess sites, make sure grading is what we need, if we need easements to work through that. But we are committed to that. We're replacing a lot of shelters too, actually, as shelters age, making sure that they're safe and in good working order. So that's part of the equation as well. So, but with that, that's what I have.
Questions?
When you looked at equity, were you only looking at the home-based side of trips or the end-based side of the trips? I know I live in the Harmar area, and I know recently there was something going on with the city of Roseville, and all the shelters were removed from those stations. And in that area, there's a lot of retail, whether it's jobs, there's, lower cost food, a Target, et cetera. And so probably the equity needs for folks, that neighborhood isn't necessarily, it's probably averagely white, averagely incomed. But a lot of folks that are probably more of the kind of quote-unquote equity populations on the home base go there. But the amenities at those stations are pretty miserable. So can you talk a little bit about the destination end of trips when it comes to equity?
Sure. So basically, instead of looking at home base or where people are going to, looking at boarding information is what we try to focus on. And so, depending on where you're starting your trip, you're going to wait in one area, and then when you're leaving work or, whatever errands that you're running, you're going to wait, at a different stop. And so that's why, people getting off the bus is important to making sure that that's safe and convenient. However, where people are boarding the bus is also where they're waiting more. So that's why we're looking at that sort of information. Does that answer your question?
Other questions?
In looking at this from a communications marketing perspective, with the bus stop placemaking partnerships, has Metro Transit packaged it as a potential for sponsors or advertisements for retail or insurance companies or anything that would want to actually buy that space and advertise in that area as well?
Sure. We do have some advertising shelters now. Previously, CBS Outdoor Advertising had a lot of bus shelters out on the street in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and a few other locations. Metro Transit has actually taken those on and been, assessing, the state of those shelters, where they are, if they're needing to be replaced in the near term. Those will have, the ad panels as well, and we're looking at having other standard shelters with ad panels also. As far as the adoptive shelter goes, it's more, you do get your name or your business entity on a sign that shelter is maintained by that person, but it's not necessarily that they would be like purchasing it or owning it. Going forward though, again, exploring opportunities to partner with communities.
Other questions?
I'm curious about your experience with the solar shelters. How has that been going?
Pretty well, actually. So the solar shelters are enabling us to provide light at a lot more shelters, much lower cost than trying to dig and trench for a utility connection at a other electrical source. They work pretty well, obviously, in the winter, when the days are a lot more cloudy. The idea, that you need light at all times, and there's just less sun to capture energy. And so, but yeah, they're working very well for the agency, and we intend to, keep evolving as the solar panels and batteries and things like that evolve.
So in the first presentation, Yingling gave some recommendations regarding the need for greater amenities in areas with longer wait times. How has that finding been understood by Metro Transit, and what, if anything, is being done to respond to that?
Sure. So actually, that's one of the reasons why the current boarding requirements, or warrants, I should say, for shelters are different in the urban cores versus suburban context. The idea is that in the urban core, you have more frequent service. In the suburbs, typically service is 30 minutes or so. So if people are waiting, they are waiting longer. Again, taking into account, though, land uses and wanting to have equitable outcomes, there's a broader set of criteria, I guess, that the agency is looking at now. As far as, though, longer wait times in urban areas, that's another thing that would be affecting future warrant considerations for shelters.
Other questions? Questions online?
Thank you for the presentation. I was especially intrigued by the farmers market, the green installation, urban green installation. I have a question. So in my presentation, I didn't mention about actually we also find a very interesting finding that the trees also help to shorten people's waiting time perception. So tree coverage at the bus stop. But tree coverage at bus stop may not be something that Metro Transit alone can provide, because a lot of the boulevard trees are, the city's responsibility to take care of. So I'm just curious whether there are joint partnership between City of Minneapolis and Metro Transit or other cities where, not only try to improve the amenity at the stop, but also surrounding environment, kind of features of the surrounding environment.
Sure, that's a really great question. My ultimate dream also would be, tree coverage at every bus stop. I have a background in landscape architecture, so trees are my jam. But, as a transit agency, we're not super well equipped to take care of urban trees, and like you mentioned, often the city is responsible for street trees, boulevard trees, things like that. However, we do recognize that it is important. That does provide an opportunity, again, though, for us to maybe partner with communities or organizations or businesses just to, again, advocate for improving the areas surrounding bus stops, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our last speaker today will be Charles Carlson, who directs the Bus Rapid Transit Project Office for Metro Transit in the Twin Cities. Charles leads a team of planners, engineers, project managers, and construction managers implementing over a dozen BRT lines in the Twin Cities. Over the past decade, Charles has led BRT projects through study, planning, design, construction, and implementation. Charles holds master's and bachelor's degrees from the University of Minnesota. Charles.
Well, thank you very much. Charles here from Metro Transit, here to talk today mostly about the A line. So we have a number of lines. We'll touch on a couple of them, but really want to focus on our experience with the A line, both in terms of its initial performance and really what we sought out to do in the context of some of the other presentations we've heard today. So this map shows our BRT system. And the lines that we've opened are the A line on Snelling Avenue, shown in the darker blue color, as well as advancing on the C line on Penn Avenue North in Minneapolis. What's behind this in red is the areas of concentrated poverty in the Twin Cities that have over 50% people of color living in them. So really, each of these lines serves at least one of these ACP 50, as we call them, areas. Some have a majority of their length inside an ACP 50. So really critical in terms of the council's focus on more equitable outcomes in terms of improving transit service for the residents of these communities and improving access to destinations for the people who live here. So a big piece of this system is expanding the reach of the metro lines. So here's some of the metro lines as of circa 2015 when we made this map. These are really the core local routes that are connecting to these metro lines. We know from the blue line that about 40% of the people riding it arrive there by bus. So if that substantial of a share of our train and dedicated BRT type riders are arriving by bus, well, let's roll that transitway experience out to a greater segment of our population. With arterial BRT, our rapid bus lines, we're moving customers. The aim is 25 to 30% faster. We're bringing that transitway experience to many, many additional riders. So the corridors shown in gold here currently the routes serving these corridors carry about 90,000 rides a day. And with the implementation of BRT and the growth in the region that's focused around these corridors, we'd be rolling that out to another 70,000 people. So imagine a $400 million project that would carry 160,000 people a day is really the magnitude of the project that we're talking about. So it's not a line or two lines. It's a system of integrated routes supporting the basic economy of the Twin Cities. And along those lines, we're serving 1 out of every 3 jobs in the whole Twin Cities region are connected on these lines, many of those job centers are not on the metro lines, but would be served by the combination of rapid bus and the metro lines. So what we sought out to do is really solve a couple big problems we have on these corridors. The first is slow speed. So buses, in many cases, buses are moving less than half the time. And we knew about the slow speeds in these corridors. What we knew less about was what's contributing to slow speed. So we did a bunch of data collection and found that as we first thought, well, getting a dedicated lane is going to be the answer here, and that's going to be really hard because we'd be taking over most of the road. That wasn't the case. The case is that it's really slow to board, one at a time through the front door, paying cash, sometimes negotiating the fare. Another big factor is red lights. So the bus is moving slower, the bus falls behind, it falls out of sequence with other traffic in the corridor, and then we end up waiting at every single red light. So our focus quickly became, well, what can we do about the big factors here that are more than half the time at red lights and boarding delay? The other thing is on the right here, the transit's role in these streets is the infrastructure is not commensurate with the role transit plays. So if you look at this snowbank-covered bus stop, this is not a happy bus trip. Your commute mode, if you're starting your day tromping through a snowbank and getting on the bus with wet feet, the rest of your day isn't happy, and you're going to want to drive alone if you can. So what can we do about this situation? It's hard, though, because these sites, a lot of times we don't have shelters in these locations, as Carol noted, because the sites are really constrained. So the picture on the left here is Penn Avenue North in Minneapolis. We have a 5-foot sidewalk against the street. We can't put a 5-foot bus shelter in a 5-foot sidewalk. And it becomes very difficult to secure a private property access for that. Similarly, we also have historically had this mindset of, we got to get the bus out of the way of these cars. And so we build things like we used to have at Snelling and University, where we shove the bus off to the side, and you're going to be there for a few minutes, both to wait while people board, but then once you're ready to leave, you're going to be pinned in by all these cars coming by. And on top of that, because we're putting you off to the side of the road, literally marginalizing our transit riders, we have a very narrow sidewalk, and then we try and come up with these incredibly narrow shelters that do very little to improve the waiting experience. But we shouldn't think about it that way. We should think about it in terms of the role transit plays in these corridors. So on these routes, buses make up about 3% of the vehicles using the corridors, but they're carrying about 33% of the riders. In this case, looking at Chicago Avenue. So we have, in these corridors, transit is punching way above its weight in terms of the role it plays. And we need to make investments that bring our infrastructure commensurate with that role. So we're doing that a few ways. We're addressing the speed factors. We're addressing the waiting experience factors. Off-board fare payment is a big tool that we're using. So you pay ahead of time. You board through all the doors of the bus. There's a proof of payment fare inspection. The rail validators for smart cards, very similar to our light rail system. So this is one big tool for us. Another big piece has been to implement raised curbs wherever possible, looking at a way that we can scale this to the context of these areas. Raising the curb many inches is very difficult. You quickly would get into business access problems, intersection ADA problems, and other factors, whereas standard curb is really most sidewalks today still a pretty big step in height. But with a raised curb, you can really very easily board a vehicle without the ramp. If you have a stroller, if you have a grocery cart, most walkers, while also having something we can easily implement or more easily implement in a dense built environment. So we also, the biggest thing we do with these projects is extend the curb actually out. Rather than pinning the bus against the curb, we bring the curb out. That provides two things. One, the bus can stop in the travel lane and quickly move along the corridor. The other is that now we have space for a clear boarding zone as well as a more robust shelter on these corridors. So we have quick on, quick off the bus, a defined platform space, and then a more visible presence within the corridor for our transit service. The buses are also built to go faster. So the rear door is much wider. It's a 56-inch door. Passengers board through each door of the bus. One of the biggest things we've seen is that when you get on the back door of the bus, you're much more likely to go into the upper back section of the vehicle. What that leads to is much more even distribution of passengers within the bus. Rather than on a regular bus, usually you'd have a bunch of people crammed around the back door, very low utilization of the upper seating, because if you get on the front door, what are your chances of walking all the way back to the back? The other big things are no fare box, as I said. It's all off-board fare payment. And then actually some innovations in terms of a faster securement device, different from our regular fleet for passengers using mobility devices. So in terms of the A-line itself, we started construction in July of 2015. A lot of the civil work was completed last December or so. And then a lot of systems work continued through the spring prior to launching service on June 11th. Here's a picture of how these shelters go up. Typically, it's less than a day in terms of the actual shelter installation. There's a frame set up around the perimeter, and then a truck crane would lift the roof segments into place. However, getting to that point takes a while. There's often a lot of utility work in terms of removing any conflicts. Many times when you're opening a 100-year-old street, there may be something you didn't know about that didn't show up in the utility survey that you may not even then know what it is. You have to figure that out. And then a lot of times also, if you're opening the street, the city utilities will want to go in and renovate and modernize. If you're already digging a hole, just let us get in there. It'll only take us a few weeks, they say. And then once everything's in, we have these systems. So here we are installing ticket vending machines in the corridor this past spring. Here's electrical and communication cabinets arriving. This houses our power system so that we can provide the consistent amenities very commensurate with what we have in our light rail platforms: security cameras, heat, light, real-time information, et cetera. So the buses began arriving in November and continued through the early part of the year. We have a pylon marker, so this is a very visible corridor identifier at night and during the day. The T on the top actually starts to pulse when a vehicle is approaching. So if you're too far away to read the real-time sign, you have an indicator that if you hurry up, you might make it to this bus. So really trying to develop this from a transit customer perspective as much as anything else. Very robust signage to identify the destinations in the corridor as well as the stations along the line. And then we launched service back in June. So since June 11th, we've carried about 450,000 people in the corridor. We're carrying about 4,800 people a day. We have days over 5,000 on the A line itself. That's in addition to remaining local service in the corridor. So overall, we're up between 35 and 40% within this corridor. And one thing that's notable about that is we were running about 10-minute service before in the corridor, and now the A line runs every 10 minutes, in addition to half-hour service on the local bus. So there wasn't a huge addition of transit service in this corridor, but the increased visibility, the ease of use, the transit information, the packaging of this really led to a significant increase in the usage, where now on Sundays we're carrying what we used to carry on weekdays. And so really a strong response to, in the scheme of things, a fairly limited investment. $27 million for this project overall. The bulk of the operating cost was paid for by replacement of previously existing bus service. So really a significant improvement to what we mostly already were paying for anyway. And it's paid off in terms of ridership. This is from our opening weekend, so people out celebrating and enjoying the new line. We carried about 15,000 people the first few days when it was free, and then we've seen growth, including since the two universities directly along the corridor began their fall semesters most recently. But we also had a presence in the corridor to help people learn about the new system, help train people in on the ticket machines in the corridor, as well as understand how to make local bus connections through the corridor as well. So here's the kind of a shot of our completed station with the investments in as the sun began to set on that first day of service. You can see there's bidirectional stations. This is on Ford Parkway, just as you're approaching the Mississippi River, looking toward Minneapolis. So beginning to see a good ridership response, and we've been operating about 95% on-time performance. So very robust, reliable, and consistent transit improvement on this corridor that we're also planning to roll out one line a year as we complete our system of a dozen lines. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So what were the in percentages? So you showed that pie chart early on of red time waiting and boarding. So how much improvement did you see with this new development in those two areas?
That's a great question. So we haven't, we're now that schools have started up again, we're entering a period where we'll be doing data collection, particularly on dwell times to begin with, so getting at that boarding time reduction. Anecdotally, it's significantly shortened. We're also carrying more passengers, so that has a little bit of an offsetting effect. However, the limited stop nature of the corridor, so there's 20 stations where there used to be like 60 bus stops. Removing all the boarding delay at many of those bus stops is a big factor in terms of what speeds the service up.
So you're moving the buses through the corridor considerably faster than you were before with local service. Are you able to operate the A line with fewer vehicles in service than you were for the 84? Sure.
So we're operating more service with the same vehicles is really the the change. We did add vehicles in the corridor because it runs more frequently when we consider the remaining local service, but we're getting more service per dollar than we were before.
Charles, can you talk a little bit about the underlying local service that still remains in the corridor, where those bus stops are, and have you had any issues with customer confusion between, am I at the right location if I'm here to catch the 84 and not the A line? And then my second question is about prioritization. You know, your map showing all the arterial BRT corridors and the concentrated areas of poverty. Have you guys done a prioritization exercise to determine kind of the priority of those corridors and which one comes next?
Sure. So on the first piece, there is remaining 30-minute local service in the corridor. What we've seen is more than what we expected in terms of the shift to the A line. It seems that people are willing to walk to get to better and faster service. So what we've seen is a pretty significant reduction beyond what we expected with Route 84, to the point where its productivity may require some adjustment in terms of the schedule that's provided. However, we have not heard a lot of confusion about the new service. I think the visible scale of the new stations helps with that, as does a pretty detailed and site-specific customized signage package that we rolled out of semi-permanent signs at the non-A-line stops, explaining to customers that the bus will come here, it won't come as frequently. For more frequent, better service, walk to whatever the nearest station would be. Remind me of your second one.
Prioritization.
Okay. Yeah. So we have a bunch of lines. We have a pretty ambitious program. We need to prioritize that. So far, there's been a couple factors that actually stemmed from an initial study we did of several corridors. One factor is the technical, sort of a technical score, so the merits on ridership, on cost effectiveness, et cetera. Perhaps equally or more important than that has been the readiness of any particular corridor. So in the case of the A line, we had a grant opportunity that was very well matched to the characteristics of this line. There was also a lot of work coming up on Snelling Avenue that MnDOT was planning, that Ramsey County was planning on Ford Parkway, that if somebody was going to be making a bunch of investment anyway, it made a lot of sense to kind of bundle that together with the transit improvement. We're seeing something very similar unfolding on Penn Avenue, where the county has a robust transportation project. We can go in at the same time and develop and deliver a better transportation outcome in partnership with this other work. So we'll probably continue along those lines.
Have people been figuring out that they have to pay before they get on pretty easily, or is there a lot of bus drivers telling people they've got to get back off and tap their card or whatever that is? Has it been fairly seamless?
It's been fairly seamless in terms of people understanding that the payment system is different. We have pretty good go-to card utilization to begin with in this corridor, where we may be looking at ways to reduce the number of steps in a ticket vending machine purchase. Right now, it's programmed around being ready to respond to any situation versus making it really fast to pay for the typical purchase, which is a single full fare ticket. So there's things we're doing that could speed that up, but from our police, fare evasion is minimal to non-existent, and from our drivers, people seem to be figuring it out fairly readily.
Question, what were the most significant factors in determining your station spacing?
Sure, so the stations are spaced about every half mile or so. The biggest factor was, number one, connecting routes. So a lot of the stations as a crosstown route, the Snelling Avenue corridor has a lot of intersecting bus service. And essentially, without exception, where there's a connecting route, there's a station. Beyond that, ridership is the next biggest piece. Beyond that, station spacing, not wanting to get too far on either side of a half mile between stations really became the driving factor. And then finally, community interest. So there were some station relocations and a station addition based on questions, concerns, and interest level raised by community neighbors through the station planning and design process.
Charles, I have a question, which is about the impact of A-Line on Green Line and Blue Line ridership. Because when Green Line was opened, actually, it not only you see that ridership gains are on the Green Line, but also ridership gains are on the Blue Line. So I'm just curious that given that this is a relatively new, unique, fast, reliable transit service, and it offer transfers to Green and the Blue Line, whether there is actually a system-level impact in terms of ridership.
Sure. So we're just beginning to dig into some of the station-level data. Anecdotally, we see the biggest growth at the Blue Line stations, the Green Line station, and then at Rosedale Mall are where we're seeing the most kind of concentrated growth. Also, anecdotally, they built a fairly high-end apartment building with a Whole Foods in it at the corner of Snelling and Selby. And that was pretty much a sleeper location before. And now, if you go out there in the morning, you'll see a bunch of people dressed in business clothes get on, ride one stop to the Green Line, and get off. So that seems to be a big growth sector, both in terms of the new development in the area, but also the transitway connection afforded by a high-quality bus route.
So you mentioned tying in with some ongoing development. On Ford Parkway, there were brand new sidewalks that were built right before the Red Line stations were built, and then those brand new sidewalks had to be torn out to make these new stations. So I'm just curious if there are any lessons learned and how to better coordinate so we're not tearing out brand new developments and better tying these things together.
Sure. So there were actually a number of coordinated projects that we were able to pull off with Minnehaha Avenue reconstruction with Hennepin County, the Ford Parkway east of Howell construction, as well as a significant construction project with MnDOT. We had also talked to the city about delaying their streetscape improvements through the core commercial area of Highland Park and Ford Parkway. 1 year, so it would better time with this project. Ultimately, a local decision was made to move ahead with that, knowing what the implications would be, and then being fine with Metro Transit doing it. They did have segments where the actual station would go that they didn't reconstruct, and then they spray painted on the ground MTC 2015 as their indicator of why that short section wasn't reconstructed.
Got a quick technical question and a larger question. The technical question is, and apologize if I missed it, what's the actual difference in travel time from what the 84 took to cover that versus the A-Line? And then on a larger scale, we heard Andy talk about the impacts on jobs and so forth, and that physical infrastructure makes a difference. We heard from you that ridership has been positively impacted by these changes, even though and this is not a dedicated infrastructure. This is one for anybody to respond to that's been talking today. I'm wondering if there's a relationship between ridership and job location, or if those are independent and both desirable, or how those interact.
Sure. So the travel time performance, one thing that was different about the 84 versus the other routes is it's not sort of a radial route coming out of downtown. So the average speed, actually to begin with, was much higher than a lot of these other urban corridors. However, we were still able to realize about a 20% improvement in the travel time by implementing the A-Line bus. It varies a bit across the day. The lower levels of travel time improvement are early in the morning, late at night, when there's really no delay anyway. The greatest levels of improvement are really in the afternoon and morning peak periods, where we have been able to overcome a lot of the delay factors with BRT. For the broader question, I think I'd leave it to smarter people than me to think about those relationships.
Well, I don't know about smarter, but I think one thing is that it's important to remember that not every not every line has the same role in the transit system. Just as Charles said, the A line's not a radial corridor. So one, it's feeding people into other corridors that allow direct access to jobs. It's also because it's a mixed traffic bus-based service. I think lines like this, it's easier to take the transit way to an existing job center. So you don't, it may be possible to just design your routing so that you're serving an area that already has a robust job center there instead of having to create one around a new station area.
I would also observe briefly that a lot of the growth that we've seen has been at Rosedale, major regional mall. A huge spike in ridership occurs around the times that the mall opens and closes. So that tells us, in part, that it's a major source for how people are getting to work at that fairly substantial job center of primarily service-type jobs.
Other questions? Questions from online?
No, our online audience is quiet today. They're there, but they're quiet.
There is one, okay. Well, thank you, Charles, then. Again, I would remind people to sign in. There are a lot more people in the room than there are on the paper. Thank everyone for attending, reminding everybody about the CTS Research Conference on November 3rd. Please sign up online. And if you're interested in getting more involved in the work of the Planning and Economy Council, talk to me or talk to Brenda.